Simplicity 98.89. It's a pretty cute little blouse. I like the style detail. This was my practice garment. This is a rayon from Mood that I had in my stash. And then this is my actual finished garment. This is made with a waffle, like a matelassé from Misan Fabrics. And that's from my London fabric haul, and I'll post that down below. But I like the pattern. I like the way it fits. I have a few issues with the construction. Of course, you know, I always do. And then there are some things that you need to look out for. So it's longer in the back than it is in the front, and it has a little pleat. So that's nice, especially if you need a little extra room or you want something floaty. It has this split here. You can see it better in the white one. So this is the top, and this buttons, and then it has this little skirt. It's a pretty shawl collar. Now, as far as the issues go, if you make the long version, I'm 5'3", I made version A, which is the short skirt version, but initially I had cut it as the long version. It was like a dress on me. It was 6 inches longer, and in the back, it hit the back of my knee, which is absolutely insane for a blouse. So if you're really tall, I mean, it works fine, but at 5'3", this hits me just about right proportion-wise. By the way, these pants are stretch trousers from Stitch Fix. I just got them and I'll link my spring Stitch Fix package in the down below. I have had them on all morning. I love them. They are super comfy. But let's talk about what's going on with this pattern. This is a rayon, so it's super floppy and it doesn't have a lot of structure. And the pattern only calls for interfacing in the collar and in the little tab piece that's underneath the buttons. There's 3 buttons here. So there's no structure in this blouse whatsoever as far as the front of the blouse where the placket would be. So it's very floppy. With the rayon, it was super, super floppy. And you have these 3 little buttons that have loops that they want you to make. So the Rollo loops are super, super tiny. I didn't make them. I don't want to drive myself insane with Rollo loops. So on this one, I used a leather, just strips of leather that I cut, because the edge doesn't have to be finished. And on the white one, I use stretch elastic cording to cover the buttons. Now, because this is rayon and it's super, super floppy and there's no interfacing, this would never stay closed. So I ended up just stitching it down and stitching it close because I can get it over my head. So that worked out fine, and it looks fine. It looks much better because it was gapping and I would have had to put snaps and then it was still gonna gap. So once I discovered I could get it over my head, I just stitched it down. And I may, depending on how the white one works, I may end up just stitching that one down also and just keep the buttons as a detail and not functioning. So that's really good. The collar construction is weird and funky. Whoever tested this pattern and made the piece for the pattern top was probably not a very good sewer or didn't have a lot of experience putting on collars. The collar is beautiful and it fits. It's just the way, the method of putting it on is weird. And you know, I did it twice and I did it wrong both times. And I've been sewing for, well, since I was about 12. So, you know, a long time. Put on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of collars. I have never had this much trouble putting on a collar. So if you're a beginner and you're thinking this is a great pattern because it doesn't have any buttonholes, you're right. However, the collar, just pay attention when we're going to talk about the collar. Just be careful and pay attention to the collar. They missed doing a gathering stitch on the sleeves, which for the rayon I needed. I didn't need it for the matelassé, but I did need it for the rayon. So depending on what fabric you're using, that's something you also need to keep in mind. But outside of that, it's a pretty cute blouse. I love this fabric, right? This fabric is from Mood. It's been in my stash forever. It's a rayon. I hate sewing with rayon, but I love the way rayon looks when it's done. You know, it's like the process is so frustrating, but the finished garment is gorgeous. So let's try on the white one. What do you think about these? Aren't these cute? I got these from Amazon. Super cute, right? They kind of go with this funky overall vibe. All right, we are getting ready to put together Simplicity 98 $89, this new really cute little white blouse, and we're going to do version A. I made up a practice garment, and I made this longer version of the skirt. Now I'm 5'3", it actually came down to my knees almost. It was like a dress. So if you're tall, the longer versions might work for you, but if you're short, the proportions are just ridiculous. So I have cut out everything, and I've come to the conclusion after making my practice garment that this pattern was either not tested or the instructions were written by someone who doesn't know how to sew, because there are a few things that we need to do to make this fit better. Now, I have this really nice white waffle fabric that I got from Nissan in London when I was there, and it's part of my fabric haul. So I went up a size because the practice garment I made was in a rayon, which is super, super thin, and this has some heft to it. So I did go up a size. We're going to talk about all the changes or options that I will offer you that the pattern doesn't use, and help improve the finished part of your garment, I think. So let's get started. All right, the first set of instructions calls for you to stay stitch the sides of piece number 1, which is the upper front. Now, if there was a severe curve here, I would say yes, certainly between these notches, but this is not cut on the bias hardly at all. So you can stay stitch it. I did on the first one on the rayon, but I'm not going to do it on this one. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. So the other thing I want to skip ahead to is the interfacing. It calls for interfacing on the collar. That's fine. And it calls for interfacing on the little placket piece that goes down the front. That's certainly fine. But there is no interfacing called for on this part of the garment, and that opens up. There's buttons there, and it's very, very floppy. So what I did is on 2 of my piece number 1s, I just cut a strip of fusible interfacing and interfaced just, this strip is an inch and a half wide, and it's just cut to where the angle of the neckline. So this is the neckline. I didn't interface that. I just interfaced this section where the buttons are going to be. So just an inch and a half wide piece of strip, just to give that some stability. So I added that. That is not in the pattern, and that is something that definitely should be there, because the blouse, once the buttons are on there, the buttons are a little heavy and it kind of hangs, and it's not a very good look. So that's the first thing that we took care of. Then step 2 wants you to make loops for the front, because there's no buttonholes in this, which is great, but there's loops around these buttons. I can't see it on here, but there's loops around these buttons, and that's a great idea if you don't want to make buttonholes, but it wants you to cut a strip this size, fold it in half, stitch it, and turn it into Rolo loops. Well, that's just like ridiculous, because you'll be there forever and so frustrated. So on my practice garment, I used strips of pleather, which the ends don't need to be finished. So I just cut strips of pleather, and I cut them about half of this. So like 3/4 of an inch wide. And then and then it wants you to cut them into segments. So for this garment, I'm going to use elastic. Just elastic cord. That's it'll make a great little loop. It matches the color. I think that that's fine, and I'm not going to put myself through cutting these, turning them, and then trying to find them and figure them all out. Not to mention the fact that they want you to cut them into sections that are 1.25 inches long. So that's 1.25 inches long, and they have to go in the seam allowance. That's ridiculous. And A, and B, why would you make this big long strip if you were only going to cut it 1.25 inches long? So the math is wrong on that. If you do use this strip, you can cut it in 3 equal sections. This is about 7 inches long. You're about 2.25 inches long, 2.5 inches long, somewhere in that ballpark. So just cut it in 3 equal lengths, and then turn it. And then you're only turning a small section. Instead of trying to turn this sewn in half with a 1/4 inch seam, you're turning something that's that big. That's crazy. You will go insane. So I'm putting that away. I'm using elastic cord. You could use a ribbon. You could use fold over elastic would be really cute if you had some kind of decorative trim that you liked. You could use anything that's small and narrow will work for this. So don't sew those long tubes. And if you're making the other version, I think it's version C, you have to make a bunch of those Rolo loops because there's loops on the pockets. Hey, cheese them. You go nuts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add our loops to the front piece. And you can see that there's circles here that show you where to put them on the right side. So I'm going to take the piece that has the interfacing for the right side. And one of the good things about looking at patterns is you can see, like I'm looking at this is the right side of the fabric. The dark gray is the right side of the fabric on this pattern. So I want to mimic this piece. So you can see I have the neck edge here and then the straight edge here. So I know this is the piece that my button loops are going on. And I'm going to cut my loops 2.5 inches. So I'm going to make each one of these 2.5 inches long, thereabouts. All right, so I've cut 3 loops, 3 pieces of this stretchy fabric at 2.5 inches long. And I'm going to overlay my tissue on the right side of the garment that I want to add the loops to. And then just put a pin where that loop is going to go. So there's a pin there, pin for this circle, and a pin for this circle. Okay. The other thing we need to do is talk about piece 3, which is the shield, the button shield. There we go. Piece 3. This is the underlap. And I've interfaced this. You'll need to cut one of them, and you're going to sew this right sides together, fold it in half, and sew it right sides together. Up here. You're just going to run this seam up across this top section. All right, you can see I've sewn my loops on to this front of the garment, and I've sewn them so they're facing the interior of the garment, because when I stitch this seam, the loop is going to turn out like that. So that's perfect. And the trick to sewing these loops on is to take, especially with these tiny elastics, is to start with one piece, right? And I get my needle situated so my needle is actually in that piece, and I back and forth stitch that a couple of times. Then at that point, that's anchored. Then I can lift up the presser foot and futz and get that second piece in there and go back and forth over it with a zigzag stitch. So that is the way to get these so that they're really close together and actually form a loop, because the stretchy stuff can be a little challenging. Now I've stitched across piece 3, I've stitched across the top, and I overlock the edge because it tells you to stitch and trim. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves with some of these big 4 patterns, is that they want you to cut a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then trim it away. Just make the seam allowance 3/8 of an inch on the pattern. It just makes so much more sense. So now we're going to apply this tab to the other front piece. And I want the piece with the interfacing on it. All right. So here's my front. This is how it's going to go together. And they want you to baste this piece and then sew it. Well, that's an awful lot of work for nothing. We're just going to apply this piece right on here, matching up this edge. I mean, if you feel uncomfortable and you feel like this piece is going to shift around on you, go ahead and baste it. I don't think that's necessary. I think it seems like a lot of work. Much ado about nothing. And we're just going to run a stitch all the way up here and attach that, because that actually ends up folding this way, right? So this, and then this goes over it. So it's actually a little shield in case this gaps a little. So nice detail. I like the detail on that. All right, so our next step is to apply piece 4 at these side seams. And you can see I have this straight seam and this curved seam. This is a princess seam. So we're going to make them fit. And you want to have this curved seam down on the bottom, because we talked about the feed dogs move that faster from the bottom piece than the upper piece, and it will help ease in some of the garments. So we're going to pin at the bottom, And if you look at this piece, this section here is fairly straight, so we'll pin up a little bit on this. Then we're going to go ahead and pin this top edge. And now we need to fit this curve, this straight seam with this convex seam. I can never remember which one's which. But you take your pins and you finger the piece all the way around. Don't stretch it. I mean, if you feel like you're going to stretch it, then you need to put that stay stitching in there. But it's a short seam. It doesn't require a lot of, and it's not a very curvy seam. So there. We're going to do the same thing on this side, pinning it exactly the same way with the curvy part underneath. All right, I've sewn my pieces. Here I sewed the flap on, right, and pressed that out, and then sewed these princess seams, and you can see how they make a dimension that takes the place of a bust dart. And I pressed the seams towards the center, and that is ready to go. So now I need to sew on my shoulder seams. And even though I've been sewing for years and years, I still lay everything out in front of me right side up. So both of these front pieces are right side up, and now I want my back piece, which is piece 5, and I'm going to lay that right side up. So this is my back neck edge and my front neck edge and my shoulder seam. So I'm going to flip my back piece over and stitch my shoulder seams to the front of my garment. So I'm going to sew the shoulder seams together, and then I'm going to stay stitch. And because this neck is cut on the bias, it really needs stay stitching. And I'm just going to run my machine stitch all the way around here at a regular stitch, single layer, around 3/8 of an inch. You could do a 1/2 inch. This has a 5/8 inch seam allowance. You want it inside the seam allowance because you don't want to have to deal with it and unpick it after you sew the seam. So you want it in the seam allowance. It's just to keep this from stretching because this is cut on the bias. And if this stretches and then we attach the facing, you're going to get a waffle, and we don't want that wobble. That's where those happen, is when one piece gets stretched out of shape. All right, so we're going to sew that, and we're also going to deal with our collar. Let's see, that is piece number 9. So we have 2 collars. One is interfaced and one is not. One has interfacing, and I use this stretch tricot interfacing, and this collar is cut on the bias, so you really need stretch interfacing. And there are notches, 2 dots, on here representing whatever size you cut. And on the interfaced piece, where those notches are, we're going to cut into the collar. So in order to keep the collar from the seam from disintegrating, we're going to sew just a little stitch across here, just about 1 inch long, right where that dot is. So I just marked the dots with pins right about the seam allowance, really close to the seam allowance, like a 1/2 inch, close to 5/8, right there, because that's going to protect this when we cut into it, which we need to do. So we're going to take care of that also. Alrighty, we're starting to get something that looks like a top. I've sewn the shoulder seams, pressed them to the back. So it's a good opportunity to try this on now to see, because you can still make a few adjustments. You could take this in a little bit. You could shorten up the shoulders a little bit if need be. So this would be the time to actually go ahead and make those adjustments. And then now we're going to deal with the collar. So we have this interfaced piece that you can barely see because I used white thread, that I've stitched this. And I'm just going to go back and remark where the notches are, where the dots are, because I've stitched about 1 inch on either side of the dot. And I'm going to clip where that dot is just to my stitching. for my size. Okay. And then what that does is this opens up this notch area here that I can fold down and press, and that's going to be part of the facing. All right, so we would just press that down. So we're going to pretend that that's pressed. I'll press it when I bring it over to the machine. Now we're going to stitch our two collar pieces together. So we're going to take the right sides together. We cut them together, so they should be good. And we're going to stitch them from this end of the curve all the way to the other end. Just pin it. It should be perfect because we used the same pattern piece and cut it at the same time. And it's cut on the bias, so it's stretchy, so be careful, pay attention to what you're doing. And again, this is one of those pieces where they want you to sew it and then trim it to 3/8 of an inch, which just drives me crazy because it's just more fabric that we don't need and we're wasting it. I'm going to stitch it and then overlock the edges, but if you don't have an overlocker, zigzag the edges, trim it and zigzag it to keep that bulk down, because especially with this, with the rayon it wasn't so bad, but this is a fairly heavy fabric. I've sewn my collar around this large edge and then pressed this seam flat. And now we're going to understitch it. And what that will do is help keep the collar from rolling. And we want the understitching to be on the interfacing side. So when I press this open, I want to press the seam towards the interface side of the collar. Before I understitch it though, I want to make sure that it works well. So I'm going to turn it right side out and just kind of finger press it. And what we're checking for is that it's balanced, that we didn't make a boo-boo somewhere along the line and for some reason these curves don't line up, because this is the part that's going to be in the front of your face, and you want to make sure that these are actually the same. Like one isn't this much bigger than the other. That would be bad. There's no way back from that. So now is the time to fix that. But there's a slight curve here, that this curve works, and everything is balanced, that it's symmetrical on either side of the collar. So to understitch this, I like to put it in the machine right side up, and then I can take my fingers as I'm going through the machine, and I want to move this seam allowance to the facing side and just stitch here really close to the seam. But you want to make sure that the seam is opened up. You don't want to have like a fold or a pucker there. You want this seam to be open to make sure. So you kind of have to spread it open and move the seam and press and stitch it at the same time. All right, so I just learned something about the pattern when I went to go put the collar on. In the instructions, which my fault, I didn't read them, it says to trim seam, understitch the collar, but it doesn't, with right sides together, match, stitch along unnotched edge. We did that. Trim, understitch the collar. And it doesn't say which side to understitch the collar on, and this picture does not help. So I knit to the next step, and I looked at the photo, and it has the understitching on the section that has this little cutout here, where that goes on the inside of the neck. But that's wrong, because this turns out to be the right side of the collar. All right. So this understitching needs to be on the piece that does not have the notch cut out of it. So that is a problem with the pattern. And I'm okay with the way this looks, because this is really nice top stitching. I used my edge foot and it looks fine, and it will be fine as the collar. It'll just look top stitched. I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem with that. Or alternatively, I could clip this side and just make a big stitch on the other side, which I'm not going to do. So I'm going to keep this as top stitching, and I might add some more top stitching detail in other places if that's the case. But keep that in mind, that this under stitching needs to be on the side that does not have the clip in it, because this is going to actually be the right side when you sew it to the gun. This edge of the collar should line up with this little edge of my front pattern piece. So I'm going to line that point up there and then pin it around. And you can see now why we stay stitched the neck edge, because we're going to be manipulating this, and also stitched these collar pieces together, because it would be a lot of fabric trying to deal with, especially with this heavy waffle cotton. There's a lot. So this pattern piece goes together really well. I didn't have any trouble getting that section together, so that went fine. And then we're going to do the same thing with this one. We're going to not line up this edge with the notch, and it sort of butts up against this facing, because this needs to move independently. You can't stitch this over it, because then this won't open, and this actually functions this way. So we need to keep that in mind. So you want to kind of butt those together. And then just walk this around. And the piece also fits together really well. So there we go. So I'm going to sew this together. I'm going to baste it, because we're going to add the facing on top of it, and you can baste it at 5/8 of an inch, but make it a real scant 5/8 of an inch, because if you see it when you go to sew the facing on and you don't incorporate it in the facing, then you're going to have to unpick it, and you don't want to do that. All right, I stitched this all the way around, making sure you don't catch this in the stitches. So when I go to put the facing on, I'm going to actually move this section way down there, so it's way out of my way. Now I want to put my facing pieces together. All right, now the pattern wants you to fold back this top section of the shoulder seam of your facing and press it and trim it. I am going to overlock it just to keep it safe, and then when I go to hand sew it to my seam allowance, then I will do that pressing portion. I do want to finish off these outside edges, whether you serge them or use a zigzag. I would avoid folding them, because you're going to get a ridge, but I would finish them somehow, because we're going to attach them to that princess seam, which is something the pattern doesn't have you do, but in order to keep them out of the way, you definitely want to do that. If you have a really light fabric, I suppose you could fold the edge over. This cotton is fairly heavy, so I don't want any extras, any extra ridges or weights. Now, if I was going to make this pattern again and redraft it, I would make my collar all as one piece. Forget all of this cutout business and just make it a true collar. This is the way you put on a collar. And then I would make a facing piece that is the same as this back neck edge. So instead of futzing around with these facings, I would just sew, a facing with a neck edge around the back, and then I could just lay it on top of the collar and stitch the whole thing. That's how you make a jacket. That's how you make a traditional blouse. This is kind of cattywampus. You would never see them do this in the workroom, ever. Because there's so much work involved. Mistakes can be made, like I made with this collar, because I stitched the wrong side. And that's based on the drawing that they have. The instructions are bare and they're not there. Now I have to sew this facing piece on. I have to hand stitch this, and I have to hand stitch the shoulder seams, when I could have done it all with the machine, which is what they would do in the workroom, and they would make it so much faster. So, however, we're going to continue with what we have. And I like the blouse pattern. It's very nice. I just think that, we're better than this. We can do a better job than this. This is so much more work than what we need to do. And I blame the pattern company, not you, or me, for that matter. So I'm going to lay my facing piece over the front edge, matching up this notch here. Make sure that for this side, make sure that your button tabs, your button pulls are facing the center of the fabric. We don't want them sticking out just yet. And I'm gonna match this all up. And this goes along the neck edge to the shoulder seam, or to the, excuse me, to this spot where we've opened up this silly collar. And we do the same thing on the other side. We're gonna fold this tab back and line this up. So now you can see that this facing will finish off the edges all the way around with the exception of this collar piece, and then we'll have to hand stitch the collar closed. But if we had this neck piece here, right, this connecting neck piece, then it would just be one big stitch and we'd fold it all under. That would make so much more sense. Okay, facings are sewed on. We made sure that we didn't get this collar piece in the way. And I'm going to finish these, obviously. I'm going to take them to the overlocker. But what happens when you turn this around is you have this really nice collar. This is going to go like this, right? Once we press it. Same thing on this side. And we have our little button loops, right? And our collar. So obviously it's not pressed, it needs to be trained. But I'm not mad about this top stitching, and I think I might even add the detail here and along here with these button loops, because I did find with the other one, even with the interfacing, this is a little floppy. So I might add a row of top stitching there and a row of top stitching here, and that will give the garment a little more structure. But you can see how much easier it is to do this without doing the side seams, for sure. So my next step is to finish all of these inside seams. I'm going to overlock them and then sew up my side seams. Before I do that though, I want to look at these facings. And after you have made sure everything is pressed and pretty and exactly the way you want it, you want to make sure that you lay these down flat, these facings, and you take care that they're exactly where they're supposed to be. Because at one point, before you start sewing the bottom, you're going to need to baste this piece along the bottom edge. And if it's not basted right, this front piece will pull. So imagine me basting this incorrectly. So say I baste this fine, I match these edges, but it ends up being a little bit shorter than I suspected. What's going to happen is this. You're going to get this bunching here, which is something that you really, like, that's not pleasant, right? That's going to look terrible. So you need to make sure that the facing is exactly the same length and is attached exactly the same way as your top. If not, you're going to get this bunching. And I think this top stitching might help that. And then also you can stitch this edge of the facing to your seam allowance if you need to. You can just kind of tack it. I would just open this edge up and kind of tack it right to the seam in a couple of places, and then that will help keep it from shifting. And then you're going to also sew it up here to this shoulder seam. But there's a lot going on here, and then obviously after you've pressed this too, now you have to go back and sew this collar piece so it covers that neck edge. So now you can see where it would be so much easier if this facing was all one piece and the collar was just all one piece and put on, and it was constructed in a manner that is traditional to construct a blouse. I don't know why they're trying to get so fancy with this collar. I don't understand the process of that, but the thought process behind that seems a little convoluted to me. But I think the pattern's cute. You know, I like the look of the pattern. I like the collar. All right, now that we've totally trashed the top assembly, This is what we've ended up with. And I made sure that this was nice and flat. The facing was nice and flat before I basted this, the facing across the bottom, because I want to make sure that there's no bubbling here. I did top stitch along the button loops and along this little tab here. I think it looks better. It seems to have less waffle, so I like that idea. It does give it a little bit more structure, and you know, because there's so many straight lines on here, and this is by your face. You want this to look nice, right? You want it to look pretty. I mean, I love the shawl collar. I'm not crazy about the construction. So, but we are here now. So let's move on to assembling the lower half, which is pretty simple. So we have piece 6, which is the lower front. And it does flare out a little bit, so you want to make sure that you get this the right way. So there's my lower front, and then piece 7, which are the side fronts. So those get sewed this way. I'm going to pin them just like everything else. I'm going to pin them at the top and at the bottom. I'm going to toss one in the middle here. Same thing with this side. Pin them at the top and the bottom, and then one in the middle. So, and we'll stitch those and overlock them. You know, the trick with sewing these pieces in the front like this is that they need to line up. You want to make sure they all line up here. So that's kind of important. So be careful with your seam allowances and how you're keeping them together. And then we have the center back, the lower back piece. That's this. My lower back is piece number 8. And there's a pleat in the back, in the center back. So we want to mark this pleat line here. So you know me, I like to mark with pins. You can certainly use chalk or pencil or whatever, you know, tailor's chalk or tailor's pencil. I'm also going to mark the center back. So I put 3 marks in my piece. I have a mark for the center back, which is here. I have a mark on each side of this pleat. So I mark this pleat and this side of the pleat. And then I'm going to turn this sideways so it's a little easier for me. And I'm going to fold on this edge pin. I'm going to fold it and bring it to that center pin. Because we want the pleat on the inside. It lays nicer. If it's on the outside, it pops out and, you know, it's just not attractive. And then we're going to take the pin from the right side and bring that to the center pin. And you want to make sure this top line here is lined up straight. So you end up with something that looks like that. So here are my 3 pins. I'm going to take those out. Those are my marking pins. And then this is what I have. And I'm going to run a stitch here right about the 5/8 inch seam allowance, just inside a little bit. And that will give me my really nice back pleat. Simple, right? So I'm going to baste this, sew the side seams on the front, and then once I've done that, I'm going to sew the front to the back at the side seams. Same thing, pin the top, pin the bottom, stick one in the middle, and I'm going to end up with a big circle. And that's going to be the bottom part of my blouse. Same thing over here. I love this fabric. It is cotton, but it's heavy, so it's kind of an interesting fabric for a blouse. And waffle fabric is everywhere. So now I have this big circle, right, with my little circular hem here. It's a little bit longer in the bottom than it is in the front. So I'm gonna sew all of that, and then we'll attach it to our front piece. Now before we attach our circle bottom to our front, we need to baste this front closed. So what I wanna do is line up these bottom pieces here and line up the edge of my button flap to where my tab is. And I'm just going to baste across the bottom here, making this closed. And I'm gonna make these meet as best I can. But I just want this closed up, so because the circle skirt is all one piece, right? And when you're doing that, just make sure that everything lines up here in the front, up at the top, because this is really where it's important. See, I've mislined it just a smidge. And I want this to line up perfectly up here at the top. And now I'm gonna repin it. Okay, so just again, just a little baste across there to hold it in place. All right, we have them all sewed together, and I gave them a little press. Keep in mind that when you press your seams for the top part in one direction, you want the bottom piece to be pressed in the other direction. At this point, the instructions have you hemming it. I suggest you wait. It is easier because there's less fabric you're dealing with, but I suggest you wait in case you want to shorten it a little bit, or if it's too short, you might want to add some banding or something to make it a little longer. Like I said before, I made the other version, and when I tried it on, it was so long, it looked horrible on me. Had I hemmed it, it would have been a waste of time because I ended up cutting 6 inches off the bottom to make it the same length as this one. So I've attached I have a big circle here, and I have a big circle here, and I'm going to attach them together. So I'm going to put them right sides together, to fold this around my top piece. I want to find my center back, so I'm going to take the side seams of my top and just fold it in half to find my center back, because I want the center of the pleat right in the middle of my back. I'm going to match that up, so I have my nice little pleat here. I'm going to match the center back up with the center of my pleat. So I know that's good, and then I'm going to match my side seams. So on the top, I press my side seams to the back. So on the bottom, I'm going to press my side seams to the front. And I'm just attaching these. I have to say the pieces go together like that. Look at that. That's perfect. Go together really well. I think it's just some of the construction style is not as clean and modern as it should be. So this is the other back side. Again, I'm going to butt my seams so I get a nice juncture there. If you don't overlock your seams and you press them open, then you don't have to, obviously you're not going to be pressing them to one side or the other. You're going to press them open. I think personally, I find that pressing them to one side, even if they are not overlocked together, gives you a better seam, but that is really just my personal opinion. So now I'm working my way to the front. This is my princess seam, which is pressed and covered with my facing. Princess seam is pressed to the front, so I'm going to make the bottom one pressed to the back, and you can see I can just roll those right up together, and you can move them around with your finger, and it gives you a really nice juncture there. And see how beautifully that goes together. Part of that is because my seam allowances are uniform all the way around, and that is super important. Same thing on this side. Make that juncture go together. Now, another thing you can do at this point is baste this seam and try it on, because if the top is too long, you can unbaste it and shorten the top, or if the skirt is too short. There's a lot of length options you can take care of at this point. Not a ton, but some anyway. And then look at this front piece, just fits together beautifully. I'm really happy with the way the pieces actually go together. And so we're gonna sew this seam, but you can baste this seam and then try it on to make sure that everything is exactly right. And you also wanna make sure that all your junctures are really good, especially with this white fabric. You're gonna see every one of these junctures if they're off. If it's a print, you have a little bit more forgiveness, but if it's a solid color, you have to be like right on with the junctures. And if you baste it, you only have to tear out a little tiny piece and just fix that. Whereas if you stitch it, you have a lot more work to unpick. So we're gonna go sew this together. All right, I stitched it, went back and gave everything a really good press after I tried it on. And you can see that, you know, these junctures on the inside, because we had the top seam going one way, the bottom seam going the other way, we have this beautiful flat juncture there. And on the other side, it matches perfectly. It all comes together in a nice little square. So we want to check all of those before you go ahead and, you know, finish off your seams or do your final stitching. And I tried it on, I'm going to hem it. I like the hem length is good. And yeah, so now we just need to add the sleeves. That's pretty easy. That is our last task, but this looks great. I'm gonna find some buttons and do some hand sewing and we'll be finished. So let's put the sleeves on. All right, now this is a woven, so these are set in sleeves. So we need to do a couple of things to the sleeves. Whoops, is that wrong? There we go. There we go. The sleeve is not symmetrical, and I'll show you in a second. But because these are woven sleeves and not knit sleeves, we need to do a little work to them that is not in the instructions. And one of the things that we need to do, this is a pretty high cap, from the notches on either side, we want to run basting stitches on each sleeve separately, somewhere around 3/8, a row around 3/8 of an inch, and then a row around 7/8 of an inch, because we need to gather that sleeve cap in just a little bit. And they eliminated that step. I tried on my muslin to do it without the gathering, and the sleeve didn't fit. So they left that step out completely. A couple of things you want to think about. You need to know that this top notch up here, it matches with your shoulder seams, this top circle. And if you fold this pattern in half, the circle, write this down. If you match up the side seams of the pattern and you fold this sleeve in half, the circle is not dead center. And that's because the sleeve is not symmetrical. And it's hard to see with this, in this video, but you can see that the sleeve pieces don't exactly meet up. And that's because the back of our body is longer than the front of our body. So there's more of a dip here on the front side. And there's more of a length here on the back side. And I know this is the back side because there's a double notch, which is the universal language for the back of the sleeve. So that's important that we know that this is the back of the sleeve. So I always put a pin in the back. And I need to know where the notch is. So I need to put a pin or a mark in the top on each sleeve. Before I sew up the sides of the sleeve, I'm going to do the gathering. And it needs to be basting, and you want to make sure you leave tails. And I'm going to do each piece individually, and you just stitch it between the two notches. So 2 rows between the 2 notches, and mostly just putting that in will suck this up enough that you can fit the sleeve in without getting any wrinkles. Then after you do that, then you can go back and sew the side seams. All right. Here are sleeves. And you can see that I've added 2 rows of basting stitches. And you want basting stitches because then you can actually like pull them. You want to get a hold of the tails and give them a tug. And when you tug them, it gathers up the fabric. We don't need to gather this much, but we need to gather it a little bit. So I'm going to turn them right sides out. have our top. Again, I like to lay everything out because you don't want the sleeves to go on the wrong side. It's unpleasant when you have to unpick them. So we marked the back. I marked it with a pin. You might have marked it with chalk or whatever. So I know that this is the back of my sleeve. So this sleeve goes on this side because the pin is to the back of my garment, which means this one should go on this side. There we go. So now my sleeves are the way they should be on my garment. I have a pin marked where the shoulder seam is supposed to meet. And I want to sew these so the sleeve is down towards the feed dogs. So the feed dogs will help me with some of that gathering. And I also want to make sure that the gathering is even on both sides and that the top of the sleeve where the dot is meets where the shoulder seam is. So to accomplish that, I am going to put my hand inside my garment and grab the sleeve where the pin is and match it up to that shoulder seam. Close, I mean, close enough, right? And I want to pin from the top side. So now I have them right sides together and I can line up that pin with my shoulder seam. Now that they're together, I can kind of move them around. And I want to line up my underarm seam with my side seam. And because my side seam is pressed to the back, I pressed the seam on my sleeve to the front. And again, I get one of those really nice junctures. Now there's no gathering underneath the notches, right? From the sleeve seam to where the notches start, there's no gathering. We don't need gathering underneath our arms. We don't need extra fabric down there. So I can pin that 1-to-1 up to where the gathering starts on the left side, and then I go back and I pin it on the other side. Matching the edges, right? So now I have pinned my bottom section of my sleeve up to the notches, and I've pinned this at the top. And just by virtue of putting those basting stitches in there, it has tightened up the sleeve just enough so it fits. If you didn't have the basting stitches in there, you would be doing a lot of twisting and pulling. Sometimes the basting stitches require a lot more effort. On the practice garment that I made, I used a rayon, and I really needed to tug on those basting stitches to get that to fit. But on this cotton, it fits really well. So I can just pin it after I've done these basting stitches now, pin it 1-to-1, and it fits pretty good. I mean, and if your sleeve is a little big, you can just give those basting stitches a little tug to fit that in, but that works pretty well. So again, baste your sleeves in, pin them all the way around, baste them in, open up the seam and make sure that you don't have any pleats or tucks before you go ahead and stitch it. And then the sleeves are on. All right, look at that. We are done except for a few finishing details. It needs a good press. We're going to hem this. You have a couple of options. I overlocked the edge, so I'm just going to turn it and top stitch it. But certainly you could do a double fold, or you could add a binding on there if you would like. If you're going to use binding, use self fabric binding. Same with the sleeves. I'm just going to turn the edges over and top stitch it. Inside, I have to finish off this collar section that we had clipped open for this obnoxious collar, and also stitch down the facings. I want to tack them to the sleeves. I'm pretty happy with the way the facings came out on this one. There's no bumping here. It's not dragging, so that's good. So I'm going to, on the inside, just tack along here and then tack up on the shoulder so the facing isn't flopping around. Yeah, and then we're done. A good press and buttonholes, so buttons. So we're gonna line up the edge of where our loops are to the edge of where the flap is. And I'm going to pin that so it doesn't shift on me. And I found that these buttons are kind of widely spaced. So if the blouse is a little snug on you, you might want to add some snaps in between the buttons, see? Just like that. And so I'm going to sew those on, but you want to make sure that this button isn't way over here. It needs to be where the button loop is going to be, like that. And we're done. It's cute. I like it. So let's see how it looks on all things. All right, here is the white one. I went up a size on this one because it is denser. It's that Matelassé heavy. And I think, you know, as I'm moving, I think I may actually stitch this one down also because I can get it over my head. I added interfacing. I added a strip of interfacing for this one when I did it, and it definitely adds the structure I need. But just the way this is put together, like, that's unflattering. So I think I may just take this and pin it and stitch this all the way down also. And then I have this nice clean finish. And these buttons are fun. I mean, I like the banding on them. This one, like I said, it's just a little loop of cording, stretch cording. So that works really well, but I do not like the gapping on that. But I'll tell you that, yeah, this one is really cute. And, you know, of course I had to change up the earrings. And yeah, I love a good white blouse. You can never go wrong. You know, it always looks crisp and appropriate. The thing is, you need to add them to your wardrobe every season because, you know, they get grimy. So new ones all the time, always adding a new blouse, new white blouse every season. But yep, this one is cute. I like this one. I like the way it fits. I like the improvements that I made on the pattern, and I think I definitely will take this and go stitch this down since I can get it off over my head, and it will definitely have a much cleaner look. But I do like these vertical lines. They really add a nice look to it. The horizontal one is fine. I think it's okay. I think it's a nice, interesting style. It's got some good style details. It just needed, the pattern construction just needs a little tweaking. But yeah, if you can get it over your head, you stitch this down, add some interfacing, work with the collar, and I think those are the big ones that you might have some issues with. So until next time, bye.